You were a budget-draining mistake that I finally stopped paying for at midnight, my biological father sneered, his voice cutting through the humid air of the upscale outdoor patio at the Capitol Grill in Hartford, Connecticut. He made a theatrical show of checking his $8,400 Breitling Navi timer, the polished steel of the luxury timepiece catching the sharp glare of the midday sun, as if to emphasize exactly how much more his time was worth than mine. Beside him, his new wife, Candace, a woman 10 years younger than the mother he had abandoned, adjusted the strap of her Gucci Marmont handbag and smoothed her dress, careful not to smudge the $150 per session spray tan that gave her skin a synthetic orange-tinted glow. My name is Cassidy Rhodes. I am 19 years old, and I just finished my first semester at Yale University with a 4.0 GPA, a feat I achieved while working 30 hours a week at a local library. But to the man sitting across from me, Marcus Sterling, I was never a daughter or a human being with aspirations. For 13 years, I was merely a line item on a spreadsheet, a monthly expense to be minimized, a recurring debt that he finally felt he had settled. He lived in a 6-bedroom mansion with heated marble floors in the gated community of Avon, while I spent my childhood in a 1998 Fleetwood Southwind trailer that leaked every time the Connecticut sky turned gray. I watched him now, his face a mask of practiced indifference as he leaned back in his leather chair, the smell of his expensive Creed Aventus cologne mixing nauseatingly with the scent of charred meat and red wine. But I am getting ahead of myself, and to understand the weight of the document currently resting in my thrift store backpack, you have to understand the sheer, calculated cruelty of the life Marcus Sterling built while I was left in the shadows. Growing up in a trailer park on the outskirts of New Britain, my reality was defined by scarcity and the constant, buzzing hum of a refrigerator that struggled to stay cold. My mother, Sarah Rhodes, worked double shifts as a certified nursing assistant at Hartford Hospital, her hands always smelling of industrial soap and exhaustion. She received $450 a month in child support from Marcus, a sum he fought to lower every single year with the help of a high-priced legal team that cost more per hour than my mother earned in a month. He was a senior partner at a private equity firm, a man whose net worth was whispered to be in the tens of millions, yet he begrudged the cost of my winter coats and the used textbooks I needed for school. I remember being 7 years old and seeing him on the local news, standing next to a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community wing he had donated $250,000 to, while that same night, my mother and I shared a single box of Kraft macaroni and cheese because the electricity bill had surged due to a cold snap. The contrast was not just a gap in wealth, it was a profound, intentional injustice that sat in my stomach like lead. Now, let me take you back to the moment the clock struck midnight on my 19th birthday. In the eyes of the Connecticut court system and the specific ironclad agreement Marcus had signed years ago to avoid a more public and messy litigation, his financial obligation to me officially expired. He didn't send a card. He didn't call to wish me a happy birthday or ask how my studies in developmental economics were progressing. Instead, he sent a formal email through his assistant, a woman named Brenda who I had never met, stating that the final direct deposit had been cleared and that all future communications regarding financial matters should cease immediately. He thought he was finally free of the mistake he had made in his early 20s with a girl from the wrong side of the tracks. He thought that by cutting the final thread, he could erase the only evidence of a life he had deemed beneath him. He was so busy celebrating his liberation that he didn't realize I had been preparing for this day since I was 15 years old. Tucked away in the corner of a public library, teaching myself the intricacies of trust law and corporate filings. The restaurant was filled with the sounds of the elite, the clinking of heavy silver against fine bone china, and the hushed tones of men discussing stock options and real estate acquisitions in Fairfield County. Marcus took a deliberate, slow bite of his $90 Wagyu ribeye, savoring the richness as if it were the taste of his own success. He looked at me with those cold, slate-gray eyes, the eyes I unfortunately inherited, and told me that I should be grateful he hadn't sued my mother for parental alienation, a claim that was as baseless as his affection. He told me that Yale was a waste of money for someone like me, and that I should have looked into a vocational program that would have put me to work sooner. Candace chimed in with a high-pitched, practiced giggle, mentioning how expensive it was to maintain their summer home in Nantucket, and how they really needed to tighten their belts this year, which apparently meant cutting off a teenager's grocery money while they contemplated a $120,000 Porsche Cayenne as a birthday gift for her. The air between us was thick with their condescension, a suffocating layer of arrogance that they wore like armor. I didn't cry, though the younger version of me, the girl who used to wait by the window of the trailer hoping a black luxury sedan would pull into the gravel lot, felt a pang of old, familiar grief. I didn't raise my voice or cause a scene that would have given him the satisfaction of calling me hysterical or ungrateful. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila envelope, the edges slightly creased from the weight of my laptop. I laid it on the white linen tablecloth, right next to his glass of $25 a pour Cabernet Sauvignon. I watched as his eyes flickered with annoyance, then curiosity, then a slow, creeping dread. The document inside was not a plea for more money or a sentimental letter detailing my childhood hurts. It was a certified copy of a forensic audit and a subsequent legal filing from the Hartford County Probate Court. You see, Marcus had spent 13 years telling the courts that his income was capped at a certain level, hiding his true earnings behind a labyrinth of offshore shell companies and consulting fees paid to his own domestic LLCs. He thought he was smarter than the system, and certainly smarter than a girl who grew up in a trailer park. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. My grandmother, his mother, had never shared his disdain for me. Before she passed away 3 years ago, she had left me a small, private trust that she had kept hidden from him, knowing exactly what kind of man her son had become. That trust didn't just provide for my first year at Yale, it gave me the resources to hire a private investigator who specialized in high-net-worth tax evasion and hidden assets. I spent 3 years piecing together the digital breadcrumbs he had left behind, every $50,000 transfer to the Cayman Islands, every undisclosed bonus, and every luxury asset he had registered under a fake corporate entity to avoid increasing his child support payments. As Marcus pulled the papers from the envelope, his smug expression began to crumble. He reached the page where the total amount of diverted income was highlighted in yellow, a figure that climbed into the mid-7 figures. The document outlined a massive case of systematic fraud against the state and a decade of perjury. Because I was now an adult, I wasn't just asking for the back pay he owed my mother, though that was part of it. The filing informed him that the IRS had already been CC'd on the full audit, and a quiet disclosure agreement was no longer an option. I watched the blood drain from his face, turning his expensive tan into a sickly shade of gray. He choked on a piece of his steak, a violent hacking sound that drew the attention of the surrounding tables. Candace hovered over him, her hand fluttering uselessly near his shoulder, looking between the legal papers and her husband with a dawning realization that her lifestyle was built on a foundation of sand. The silence that followed his coughing fit was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of 13 years of lies collapsing in on themselves. I stood up, adjusting the strap of my bag, feeling the weight of the moment settle into my bones. I told him that the budget-draining mistake had just become the most expensive person he had ever met. I reminded him that while he was busy checking his watch, I was busy checking his ledgers. The reality was that family isn't about the DNA you share or the money you send to stay out of jail. Family is about who shows up when the world is quiet and dark. He had chosen to be a ghost in my life, a phantom defined only by a transaction, and now the transaction was finally complete, but not in the way he had planned. As I walked away from the table, leaving them in the middle of their ruined lunch, the sun felt warmer on my back than it ever had in that drafty trailer. I walked out of the restaurant and toward the bus stop, knowing that for the first time in 19 years, I wasn't an expense. I was a person, fully realized and finally, undeniably free. The moral of the story is that you can try to bury your past under a mountain of gold, but the truth has a way of digging itself out, especially when you underestimate the person you left in the dirt. Family isn't blood, family is the loyalty you earn, and Marcus Sterling had earned exactly what was coming to him. The contrast was not merely offensive, it was a visceral, disgusting display of inequality that felt like a permanent weight against my chest every time I drew breath in the zip code he occupied. My biological father, Harrison Vanderbilt, exists in a stratosphere of wealth that most people only see in filtered social media posts or architectural magazines, operating as the CEO of a tech logistics firm headquartered in the heart of Palo Alto, California. His company, Vanderbilt Nexus Systems, boasts an audited annual revenue of $18.4 million, a figure he frequently mentions during interviews to emphasize his self-made mythos, despite the fact that his success was built on the backs of people he considers disposable. He resides in a sprawling 7-bedroom smart home that looks more like a fortress of glass and steel than a residence, protected by a $200,000 integrated security system featuring thermal imaging cameras and biometric scanners at every entry point. The landscaping alone, a meticulously curated collection of drought-resistant Japanese maples and synthetic turf that never fades, costs more in monthly maintenance than my mother earns in a year of grueling labor. While he was adjusting the climate control of his wine cellar from an app on his gold-rimmed smartphone, my mother and I were cramped into a 650-square-foot apartment in a neglected corner of the city where the infrastructure was a constant reminder of our status. In our neighborhood, the city didn't even bother to keep the lights on for the people coming home from late shifts. Like clockwork, the amber streetlights outside our cracked window would flicker and die at exactly 2:45 a.m. every single night, leaving the cracked pavement in a shroud of oppressive, dangerous darkness. Our living room served as a dining area, a study, and a laundry room all at once, with the lingering scent of damp drywall and cheap pine sol acting as the permanent olfactory backdrop to our lives. To keep us afloat and pay for the basics that Harrison refused to acknowledge as his responsibility, I worked 2 exhausting jobs while maintaining my status at the top of my class. I spent 24 hours a week at a greasy, high-volume diner called the Rusty Spoon, where the air was thick with the smell of old frying oil and the floor was permanently slick under my feet. I earned exactly $14.25 an hour, plus meager tips from people who were often just as broke as I was, my hands becoming calloused and red from the industrial-strength degreaser we used to scrub the stainless steel counters. On the weekends, when other kids my age were at beach parties or sleeping in, I was at a dry cleaner's, standing for 10 hours a day in a humid haze of chemical steam, pressing the expensive silk shirts of men who looked exactly like my father. The physical reality of our lives was a study in profound injustice that I felt in every step I took. I wore $15 sneakers pulled from a disorganized discount bin at a warehouse store, the soles so thin that I could feel every pebble and uneven crack in the sidewalk as I walked the 3 miles between my jobs to save on bus fare. My feet would ache with a dull, throbbing intensity by the time I reached our apartment at midnight, the cheap canvas of the shoes stained with grease and chemical solvents. Meanwhile, Harrison celebrated a trivial milestone like a 6-month anniversary by purchasing Candace a 2024 emerald green Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon, a vehicle with a sticker price of $115,000 that she drove with a practiced air of boredom. I remember seeing that car parked in front of a high-end boutique while I was carrying a heavy bag of groceries back to our apartment. The sheer, polished arrogance of that machine, with its custom leather interior and brushed aluminum accents, felt like a personal insult. It represented a sum of money that could have paid for my entire 4-year degree and secured my mother's retirement. Yet it was tossed away as a shiny toy for a woman who looked at me like I was a smudge on the sidewalk. Harrison's world was one of curated perfection and absolute control, where the cost of a single dinner at a place like Nobu exceeded our monthly utility budget. I would sit at our small, wobbly kitchen table under the flickering light of a 60-watt bulb, staring at a stack of past due notices for the water bill and the electricity, while the local news featured segments on Harrison's latest philanthropic gala. He was praised for donating $50,000 to an animal shelter or a prestigious art gallery, the cameras capturing his wide, charismatic smile as he shook hands with local politicians. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He was a man who would spend thousands on a vintage bottle of Macallan 25-year-old scotch to impress a business associate, but who had filed a 14-page legal objection when my mother requested an additional $200 a month to cover the cost of my dental braces. He treated my existence as a clerical error that needed to be corrected or suppressed, ensuring that any financial support was the absolute legal minimum, calculated down to the cent, to ensure I never felt a moment of the security he draped around himself like a tailored suit. My mother's face was a map of the toll this took, the fine lines around her eyes deepening every time she looked at the rising price of eggs or the cost of the generic brand medication she needed for her chronic back pain. She had once been a vibrant woman, but years of trying to squeeze a life out of the crumbs Harrison dropped had left her quiet and constantly vibrating with an underlying anxiety. We lived in a state of hyper-awareness regarding our finances, where a broken shoelace or a missed shift at the diner felt like a looming catastrophe. I would watch her count out quarters from a ceramic jar just to make sure we had enough for the laundromat, her fingers trembling slightly, while I knew that Harrison's smart home had 3 separate laundry rooms with high-end Miele appliances that probably cost $5,000 a set. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the psychological warfare of being told, through every luxury car and every gated entrance, that we were less than. It was the crushing realization that to the man who shared my DNA, my comfort and my future were worth less than the security system he installed to keep the world away from his hoard. I remember one specific Tuesday evening, the rain coming down in cold, gray sheets that leaked through the seals of our apartment window, soaking the carpet and bringing with it the smell of wet city asphalt. I was trying to study for my final exam in advanced calculus, my fingers stiff from the cold because we kept the thermostat at 62 degrees to save on the heating bill. I looked up his company's latest quarterly report on my ancient, cracked-screen laptop, seeing the rows of black ink and the soaring profit margins. I saw a photo of him and Candace on a private jet, toasted with crystal flutes of champagne on their way to a week-long retreat in the Maldives. The cost of that single flight would have covered our rent for 5 years. The disparity wasn't just a gap, it was a canyon, a jagged rift in the earth that he stood on one side of, waving a hand of dismissive indifference while we scrambled in the dirt on the other. I realized then that Harrison didn't just want to be rich. He wanted the people he had discarded to remain poor, as if our struggle was the necessary shadow to his brilliant artificial light. Every morning, I would wake up at 5 a.m. to the sound of the neighbor's barking dog and the distant roar of the freeway. The physical exhaustion settled deep in my joints. I would pull on my $15 sneakers, lace them tight to ignore the holes in the toes, and prepare myself for another day of scrubbing and serving. The rage I felt wasn't a hot, impulsive thing. It was a cold, steady burn, a mechanical determination to take every ounce of the rejection he threw at me and turn it into the fuel I needed to climb out of that 650-square-foot box. I looked at the flickering streetlights that died at 2:45 a.m., and I promised myself that one day I would be the one holding the switch. I would be the one who decided when the lights stayed on. Harrison Vanderbilt thought he had won because he had the 7 bedrooms and the G-Wagon and the $18.4 million in revenue. But he had forgotten that he had given me the one thing wealth can never buy, the absolute, unwavering lack of anything left to lose. He had turned his daughter into a stranger, and in doing so, he had created his own most dangerous auditor, someone who knew exactly how much he owed and was finally ready to collect the debt with interest. The silence of our small apartment was often filled with the hum of the old refrigerator, a sound that felt like the heartbeat of our poverty, rhythmic and struggling. In that silence, I would visualize the floor plan of his mansion, which I had found online through property records, memorizing the layout of the rooms I would never be invited into. I knew the brand of his $15,000 Sub-Zero refrigerator and the exact model of the 85-inch 8K television that hung in his media room. These details didn't make me jealous. They made me precise. They were data points in a larger equation of negligence. When I saw him on social media, posing in his $3,000 Tom Ford suit, I didn't see a successful businessman. I saw a man who was terrified of being seen as ordinary, a man who used gold and glass to hide the fact that he was morally bankrupt. The contrast between my life and his wasn't just disgusting. It was the blueprint for my escape, a reminder that the only way to beat a man like Harrison Vanderbilt was to become a force he couldn't quantify on a spreadsheet or dismiss as a monthly expense. I was moving toward a future where his security system wouldn't be able to keep the truth out, and his $115,000 cars wouldn't be able to outrun the consequences of the life he had so casually cast aside. The betrayal happened on June 15th, the day of my high school graduation. Under a sky so clear and blue, it felt like a mockery of the storm brewing beneath the surface of my life. The temperature had climbed to a sweltering 89 degrees Fahrenheit by 10 in the morning, the heat radiating off the asphalt of the stadium track in shimmering waves that made the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. I was standing on the podium, the heavy fabric of my royal blue valedictorian robes clinging to my back with sweat, looking out at a sea of faces that blurred into a mosaic of expectations and hidden resentments. I had worked myself to the point of exhaustion for 4 years, staying up until 3 a.m. under the dim glow of a flickering desk lamp to ensure my GPA remained a perfect 4.0, all because I harbored a naive, childish hope that academic excellence would finally make me visible to the man who shared my last name. When I finished my speech, a carefully crafted address about resilience and the power of the self-made future, a roar of applause erupted from the bleachers, led by my mother whose hands were red from clapping so hard. But in the cordoned-off VIP section near the front, where the chairs were padded and the shade was guaranteed, Harrison Vanderbilt remained perfectly still, his hands resting motionless on his knees. He didn't clap, he didn't smile, and he didn't even acknowledge the standing ovation I was receiving from my peers. Instead, he simply stared through me, smelling of expensive Cuban cigars and the cold, metallic scent of success that has no room for sentiment. The after-party was held on the manicured great lawn of the country club, an exclusive expanse of emerald green grass that felt more like a carpet than nature, surrounded by white linen-covered tables and waiters circulating with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. I was still wearing my gold honor cords and my medal, feeling a brief, fleeting sense of accomplishment that was destined to be crushed within minutes. Candace approached me first, her movements practiced and feline, navigating the uneven terrain with a terrifying level of precision in her $3,000 Versace Medusa biggie heels. I watched as the spiked heels sank slightly into the soft, expensive turf with every step she took toward me, her face a mask of surgical perfection and calculated malice. She didn't offer a congratulation or a hug. She didn't even mention the fact that I had just been named the top student in a class of 500. Instead, she leaned in close enough for me to smell her cloying floral perfume and the faint scent of the white wine she had been sipping since the ceremony ended. With a voice that was as sharp and cold as a razor blade, she looked me directly in the eye and delivered the blow they had clearly rehearsed in the back seat of their climate-controlled limousine. "Don't expect a college fund, Cassidy," she said, the words dripping with a casual cruelty that made my blood run cold despite the oppressive heat of the afternoon. She adjusted her diamond-encrusted sunglasses and smoothed the silk of her designer sundress, acting as if she were discussing a minor clerical error rather than the destruction of my future. "Your father already did a quick calculation this morning, and he has paid exactly $216,000 in child support over the last 13 years, which is more than enough to consider his debt to you settled in full. You have officially been paid off," she concluded, her lips curling into a thin, triumphant smile that didn't reach her eyes. Behind her, Harrison stood like a silent sentinel of indifference, nodding his head in slow, rhythmic agreement while he took a long, deliberate sip from an $18 glass bottle of Fiji water that had been imported specifically for the event. He didn't defend me, he didn't temper her words, and he didn't look at me with even a flicker of the pride a father should feel for a daughter who had just conquered her world against all odds. He stood there in his $4,000 custom-tailored linen suit, treating me like a complete stranger who had the audacity to ask for a loan after a long history of bad credit. The weight of that number, $216,000, hit me with more force than a physical strike, because I knew exactly how he saw it. To Harrison Vanderbilt, I wasn't a child to be nurtured or a person to be loved. I was a financial liability that had finally reached its maturity date. He had spent years tracking every cent, every court-ordered payment, and every adjustment for inflation, waiting for the clock to strike midnight on my childhood so he could close the ledger and walk away with a clean balance sheet. I looked at the bottle of water in his hand, a luxury item that cost more than the lunch I had eaten every day for a year, and realized that to him, my education and my well-being were just numbers to be subtracted from his net worth. The sun continued to beat down on the lawn, the sounds of other families laughing and celebrating echoing in the distance. But for me, the world had gone completely silent. I felt the sweat on my neck turn to ice as I realized that the man I had spent my entire life trying to impress was currently calculating the ROI on my existence and finding it lacking. Harrison finally spoke, but his voice didn't contain a hint of warmth or even the anger I might have preferred over his absolute neutrality. He told me that he had already instructed his lawyers to file the final paperwork to cease all payments, and that any further attempts by my mother to seek financial assistance for my university tuition would be met with a countersuit for harassment. He spoke about his wealth as if it were a fortress he had built specifically to keep me out, mentioning how hard he had worked to earn every dollar and how he didn't believe in creating welfare dependence out of his own offspring. He stood there, the sunlight reflecting off the polished chrome of his luxury SUV parked just a few yards away, and told me that the $216,000 was my inheritance, my start in life, and my final payout. He treated the ending of our relationship as a successful business merger that had reached its natural conclusion, a liquidation of assets where I was the surplus inventory being cleared out to make room for his new life with Candace and the children they would undoubtedly raise with every advantage I was being denied. I looked at my mother, who was standing a few feet away, her face pale and her eyes filling with tears as she overheard the exchange. She had worked 60-hour weeks at the hospital, her back constantly aching and her hands perpetually dry from the harsh sanitizers, all to ensure that I had the books and the quiet time I needed to study. She had sacrificed her youth and her health to fill the gaps Harrison left behind, and now she was watching the man who lived in an $18.4 million empire tell her that her daughter was paid off. The injustice of it was a physical ache in my chest, a burning sensation that started in my throat and radiated outward. I wanted to scream, to knock the expensive water from his hand, to tear the Versace heels off Candace's feet, but I remained perfectly still. My dignity the only thing I had left that they couldn't put a price tag on. I realized in that moment that they weren't just refusing to pay for college, they were attempting to erase the very idea of me as a daughter, reducing my childhood to a series of bank transfers and legal obligations that had now expired. The sound of the high-end sound system playing light jazz in the background felt like a surreal soundtrack to my own execution. I looked at the other graduates, kids whose parents were hugging them and handing them keys to new cars or envelopes filled with tuition checks, and I felt a profound sense of isolation. I was the valedictorian, the smartest person in the room according to the state of California, and yet I was standing there being treated like a debt that had been successfully settled at a discount. Candace turned away then, her task completed, her heels clicking against a stone walkway as she headed toward the buffet, her laughter ringing out like broken glass. Harrison followed her after giving me one last, cold nod, the kind of gesture you give a business rival you've just outmaneuvered. He didn't even say goodbye. He just turned his back and walked into the shade of the clubhouse, leaving me standing in the 89-degree heat with my royal blue robes and my useless gold medals. I stood there for a long time, the shadow of the country club lengthening across the grass as the party continued without me. I reached into the pocket of my gown and felt the small, folded piece of paper I had carried with me all day, my acceptance letter to Yale. They thought they had won because they held the checkbook, but they had forgotten that they had spent 18 years teaching me how to survive on nothing but my own drive. If I was a budget-draining mistake to Harrison Vanderbilt, then I was going to be the most expensive mistake he ever made, not in dollars, but in the legacy of the woman I was about to become. I watched his black Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon pull out of the parking lot, the sunlight glinting off its custom emerald green paint, and I promised myself that I would never again let a man with a Breitling watch tell me what my time was worth. The $216,000 he was so proud of was a drop in the ocean compared to the price he was going to pay for turning his back on the only person who actually knew the truth about the hollow, gilded world he called a life. Family isn't about the debt you owe, it's about the presence you provide, and on that June 15th, Harrison Vanderbilt proved he was the poorest man I had ever met. That night, the air in our neighborhood felt heavier than usual, a thick blanket of humidity and disappointment that seemed to seep through the thin glass of the windows as I retreated to the only sanctuary I had left, which was my mother's battered 2012 Toyota Corolla. I sat in the driver's seat, the worn fabric of the upholstery pressing against my back, while the cramped interior filled with the cloying, artificial scent of a cheap vanilla air freshener that hung from the rearview mirror, its sweetness trying and failing to mask the smell of old receipts and the faint, metallic odor of the engine's slow decay. The car was a testament to a life of making do, with its cracked dashboard and the glove box that only stayed shut if you slammed it just right, a stark and painful contrast to the climate-controlled leather interiors of the vehicles Harrison Vanderbilt collected like trophies. I sat there in the dark, illuminated only by the flickering amber glow of the streetlights that were mere minutes away from their nightly 2:45 a.m. expiration, and I felt a clarity that I had never experienced before, a cold and sharp realization that the grief I was carrying was a weight I no longer had to bear. I reached into the cluttered center console and found a thick red Sharpie and a ragged piece of cardboard torn from a shipping box, and with hands that had finally stopped shaking, I began to perform a different kind of audit than the ones my father used to justify his negligence. I started to write, the red ink bleeding into the porous brown surface of the cardboard as I documented the true cost of being a Vanderbilt, a cost that wasn't measured in the $216,000 he so proudly threw in my face, but in the moments he had systematically erased from my life. I wrote down the number 9, a bold and jagged digit representing every single dance recital he had promised to attend and subsequently missed, leaving me to scan the audience from behind the velvet curtains of the high school auditorium, hoping to see a custom-tailored suit in a sea of casual wear, only to find an empty seat, or my mother sitting alone with a small, encouraging smile. I moved to the next line and wrote the number 13, the count of every Christmas he had spent in Aspen, Colorado, or St. Bart's, surrounded by high society acquaintances and the artificial warmth of expensive parties, while my mother and I shared a small grocery store chicken in our 650-square-foot apartment. I visualized the photos I had seen on social media of him clad in $2,000 Moncler ski gear, laughing in front of a roaring fireplace in a multi-million-dollar chalet, while I was wrapping a scarf around my neck inside our home because the heating bill was too high to justify turning the dial past 60 degrees. The list continued as I detailed the "I forgot" text messages that had become the soundtrack of my upbringing, those brief, dismissive bursts of digital indifference that usually arrived 3 hours late or not at all, sent by an assistant or perhaps by him during a momentary lull in a board meeting. I recorded the birthdays marked by nothing but a generic card with a pre-printed signature and the graduation ceremony where he had treated my valedictorian speech like a nuisance that was delaying his lunch at the country club. As I looked at the cardboard, now covered in the angry red slashes of my history, I realized with a profound and startling certainty that the Vanderbilt name wasn't a privilege to be guarded or a legacy to be cherished. It was a poison, a slow-acting toxin that had been leaching into my self-worth since the moment I was old enough to understand that I was being treated as a secondary priority. The name represented a world of glass and steel, where people were valued only for their utility or their optics. A world where a $115,000 Mercedes was an anniversary gift, but a daughter's tuition was a budget-draining mistake that needed to be liquidated. The silence inside the Toyota was absolute, broken only by the occasional distant sound of a siren or the hum of the city. And in that quiet moment, I decided that the man who viewed me as a debt would no longer have the satisfaction of having his name attached to my future. I saw the name Vanderbilt on the top of my Yale acceptance letter, and for the first time, it didn't look like an achievement. It looked like a brand, a mark of ownership by a man who didn't even know my middle name without checking his phone. I realized that by carrying his name, I was giving him a claim to the person I was becoming, allowing his shadow to loom over the 4.0 GPA I had earned with my own sweat and the career in economics I was going to build with my own intellect. He had spent 18 years trying to distance himself from me, treating my mother and me like a legal liability to be managed by firms that charged $600 an hour, and I decided right then that I would grant him his wish in a way that he never expected and could never retract. I thought about the $18.4 million in revenue his firm generated and the $200,000 security system that protected his 7-bedroom fortress, and I understood that all of that wealth was designed to create distance, to ensure that the mistakes of his past could never touch the polished surface of his present. But he had made a fundamental error in his calculations, an error that no amount of high-priced accounting could fix. He had assumed that by cutting me off financially, he was the one taking control, when in reality, he was handing me the scissors. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, my face pale in the dying light, and I saw a woman who was no longer defined by the lack of a college fund or the presence of a $15 pair of discount sneakers. I was the one who had survived the 89-degree heat of a graduation where my own father refused to clap, and I was the one who was going to walk onto the Yale campus, not as the daughter of a tech mogul, but as a person who had emerged from the flickering shadows of a town that couldn't even afford to keep its streetlights on. The red Sharpie felt like a weapon in my hand, a tool of reclamation that I used to cross out the word Vanderbilt on the cardboard with such force that the tip of the marker began to fray. I was done waiting for a validation that was never coming, and I was done being the silent recipient of his calculated cruelty. I thought of my mother, sleeping fitfully in the apartment just a few yards away, her hands scarred from the chemicals at the dry cleaner and her back ruined from the double shifts at the hospital, and I knew that the name she had fought to protect was nothing more than a shackle. She had stayed for me, she had endured for me, and she had allowed herself to be belittled by Harrison's legal teams for a pittance of child support, all so I could have a chance to stand where I was standing. By stripping away the Vanderbilt name, I wasn't just freeing myself, I was honoring the woman who had actually done the work of raising me, the woman whose name was synonymous with sacrifice rather than spreadsheets. As the clock on the dashboard clicked toward 2:45 a.m., I watched the streetlights outside begin to fail, one by one, the amber glow vanishing into a deep, uncompromising dark that matched the resolve hardening in my chest. I sat in the pitch black of the Corolla, the scent of vanilla now faint and stale, and I felt a strange, soaring sense of liberation that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with identity. Harrison had spent $216,000 to pay me off, to settle his account and close the book on a daughter he deemed a mistake. But he didn't realize that by doing so, he had forfeited his right to see how the story ended. He had bought himself a future where I didn't exist, and I was more than happy to give it to him, but on my terms, not his. I would take the 4.0 GPA, I would take the Yale degree, and I would take the relentless, diamond-hard ambition he had inadvertently gifted me by trying to crush my spirit. But I would do it under a name that he didn't own. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting my face, and I carried that piece of cardboard back toward our apartment like it was a sacred text. The man who checked his $8,400 Breitling while his daughter spoke of her future was about to find out that time is the one thing you can't buy back once you've wasted it on the wrong things. He had spent years ensuring I didn't have a seat at his table, and I was finally ready to tell him that I had built my own, and his name wasn't on the guest list. As I walked up the cracked concrete stairs to our home, I looked up at the stars, which were visible now that the city lights had died, and I realized that they didn't belong to anyone, and neither did I. I was Cassidy Rhodes, the daughter of a woman who never gave up, and the architect of a life that was about to become Harrison Vanderbilt's greatest regret. The poison was out of my system, the debt was canceled, and for the first time in my 19 years, the ledger was balanced in my favor. I went into the kitchen and sat at the wobbly table, the same place where I had studied by the light of a 60-watt bulb, and I took out the legal forms for a name change that I had printed out weeks ago in secret. I filled them out with the red Sharpie, every letter clear and defiant, feeling the weight of the Vanderbilt legacy lifting off my shoulders with every stroke of the pen. It was a small act, a few pages of paperwork and a filing fee I had saved up for from my tips at the diner, but it felt more significant than any sum Harrison had ever transferred into a bank account. It was the moment I stopped being a monthly expense and started being a person who defined her own value. The man who lived in the mansion in Avon could keep his revenue and his security systems and his emerald green G-Wagon because I had something he would never understand: the power to walk away from a throne I never asked to inherit. I was Cassidy, just Cassidy, and that was more than enough to change the world. Exactly 2 weeks after my 19th birthday had passed in a silent blur of cheap coffee and calculated resolve, I found myself standing in the heart of downtown San Francisco, gazing up at the gleaming facade of a skyscraper that housed the law offices of Schuyler Sterling. The transition from the gravel-dusted trailer park and the flickering streetlights of my old life to this temple of glass and corporate power was jarring, but I moved with a cold, mechanical purpose that surprised even me. As the elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, I was greeted by an atmosphere that felt like a different planet, a world where the air was perfectly pressurized and carried the rich, heavy scent of century-old Italian leather furniture and $60 an ounce espresso being brewed in a sleek chrome Jura machine in the corner. Schuyler Sterling was not just a lawyer, she was a high-profile tactical architect of legal warfare, a woman who charged more for a 15-minute consultation than I earned in a month of scrubbing grease off diner tables at the Rusty Spoon. I sat across from her at a desk made of a single slab of polished black obsidian, the weight of my backpack containing my thrift store laptop and my handwritten list of red-inked grievances feeling like a literal anchor to the reality I was trying to escape. I didn't flinch when I handed over the $550 filing fee for a formal name change, nor did I hesitate when I pulled out the $2,000 I had painstakingly saved from 3 years of tips and extra weekend shifts at the dry cleaner to hire a specialized private investigator. This wasn't just about changing my signature. It was about the systematic dismantling of a lie that had been sold to the courts for over a decade. Schuyler looked at me with a sharp, discerning gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of my $15 discount sneakers and my faded Yale sweatshirt, recognizing a level of ruthlessness that usually took her clients 40 years to develop. We spent the next several hours diving into the digital abyss of the Vanderbilt logistics tax returns, documents that Harrison Vanderbilt had assumed were buried behind so many layers of corporate shielding that no one would ever bother to look. The investigator we hired, a man who worked in the shadows of data breaches and offshore bank records, had begun to unspool the thread that Harrison had left hanging. We discovered a labyrinth of financial deception that was as predictable as it was disgusting. Harrison had been funneling exactly $400,000 a year into consulting fees paid directly to a domestic LLC registered in Candace's maiden name. This shell company had no employees, no physical office space, and no legitimate business purpose other than to act as a financial vacuum, siphoning off his personal income to keep his official earnings within a lower bracket that capped his child support obligations. As the sun began to set over the Golden Gate Bridge, casting long amber shadows across Skylar's obsidian desk, the full scope of the betrayal came into focus through a series of spreadsheets and bank statements. Harrison had spent the last 13 years claiming he was barely breaking even on certain logistics contracts, all while he was secretly padding Candace's lifestyle with the very money that should have been paying for my medical insurance, my dental work, and my future education. I watched as Skylar highlighted a specific transaction from 3 years ago, a $50,000 bonus paid to Candace's shell company during the same month Harrison had filed a legal motion to reduce my mother's $450 monthly support check because of a supposed market downturn. The contrast was so sharp, it felt like a physical sting. This man had lived in a 7-bedroom smart home with a $200,000 security system, buying $115,000 Mercedes-Benz G-Wagons for a woman who did nothing but adjust her $150 spray tan, while he was legally perjuring himself to avoid giving his own daughter an extra $100 for textbooks. The cold, logical part of my brain, the part that had earned me a 4.0 GPA at Yale, began to categorize this data not as a source of pain, but as a collection of high-yield ammunition. I sat there in that high-end office, the hum of the city below us muted by the thick, soundproof glass, and I felt the last remnants of my childhood hope for a father's love finally evaporate into the ether. Every PDF we pulled from the encrypted servers, every tax filing that didn't add up, and every undisclosed offshore account was a nail in the coffin of Harrison Vanderbilt's reputation. I took every single one of those documents, thousands of pages of incriminating financial evidence and sworn testimonies, and I transferred them onto a $15 encrypted thumb drive I had purchased from a generic electronics store. It was a small plastic rectangle, no larger than a house key, but it contained the power to incinerate the $18.4 million empire he had built on the foundation of our poverty. I attached the drive to my keychain, right next to the dented key to my mother's 2012 Toyota Corolla and the plastic loyalty card for the diner where I still worked the graveyard shift. That keychain was the most valuable thing I owned, a ticking time bomb of truth that I carried in my pocket while I walked through the world as a ghost of his past. Skylar informed me that the process for the name change was moving through the court system with mechanical efficiency, and within weeks, the name Cassidy Vanderbilt would be struck from the public record, replaced by Cassidy Rhodes, a name that carried no weight of gold but was untainted by the blood of corporate greed. She also advised me on the legal implications of the data I now possessed. It wasn't just about back pay for child support. It was about systematic tax evasion and fraud against the state of California. Harrison hadn't just cheated me, he had cheated the government, and the penalties for that were far more severe than anything a family court judge could impose. I realized then that I was no longer a victim of his neglect. I was the auditor of his downfall. I thought about the 89-degree day of my graduation, the smell of his Cuban cigars, and the way he had nodded while Candace told me I was paid off. They had thought $216,000 was the price of my silence, a final settlement to clear me from their books, but they had failed to realize that the most dangerous person in the world is the one you've trained to value intelligence over comfort. I left Skylar's office as the city lights began to twinkle like diamonds against the dark velvet of the San Francisco night. I walked toward the bus station, my hand deep in my pocket, gripping the encrypted thumb drive as if it were a talisman. I felt a strange sense of calm, a hyper-focus that made the noise of the traffic and the neon signs feel distant and unimportant. I was 19 years old, and I was about to embark on a semester at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, not as a charity case or a budget-draining mistake, but as a woman who had already outmaneuvered a millionaire before her first class began. The $550 I spent on the filing fee was the best investment I had ever made, far better than any stock option or real estate deal Harrison had ever brokered. It was the price of my soul, bought back from a man who never deserved to own a piece of it. As I sat on the bus, watching the skyline recede, I thought about the moral weight of what I was about to do. Family isn't about the name on a tax return or the bank account that funds a private jet. Family is the integrity you maintain when no one is watching, and the loyalty you show to the people who actually bled for you. Harrison had chosen his path, and now I was choosing mine. The drive rattled against the metal of my keys as the bus hit a pothole, a small, rhythmic sound that reminded me of the ticking of a clock. I knew that Harrison was likely at home right now, perhaps sitting in his media room or drinking a $25 a pour Cabernet while he discussed his next logistics merger, completely unaware that the girl he had discarded was currently carrying his ruin in her pocket. He had spent years protecting his $18.4 million with $200,000 security systems and high-priced legal teams. But he had left the back door wide open when he underestimated the girl who grew up in a 650-square-foot apartment. He had taught me how to count, how to analyze, and how to survive, and now I was going to use those skills to ensure that the Vanderbilt name was remembered not for its wealth, but for its spectacular public collapse. The $15 thumb drive felt heavier than it actually was, a physical manifestation of 13 years of missed recitals and I forgot texts. I wasn't just seeking a name change, I was seeking a complete restructuring of the power dynamics in our family. By the time I was finished, the $216,000 he had paid would look like a bargain compared to what he was going to lose. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the cool glass of the bus window, listening to the engine's low hum, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I knew exactly what was on that drive, and I knew exactly when I was going to use it. The account was finally about to be settled, and I was the one who was going to sign the final check. As I walked the final few blocks to our apartment, passing under the streetlights that were still stubbornly glowing before their 2:45 a.m. deadline, I felt a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in years. I didn't belong to the Vanderbilt mansion or the country club or the VIP section of a graduation stadium. I belonged to the woman who was waiting for me inside that small apartment, the woman whose name I was proud to take as my own. I thought of my mother's 2012 Toyota Corolla and the way it always smelled of vanilla, a scent that now represented resilience rather than poverty. I was Cassidy Rhodes, and the thumb drive on my keychain was the key to a future that Harrison Vanderbilt could never buy his way into. The contrast between my life and his was still there, but it no longer felt like a source of disgust. It was a map of where I had been and a promise of where I was going. I was no longer a budget item to be minimized. I was a force of nature that was about to break through the glass walls of his perfect artificial world. The $400,000 in shell company fees was just the beginning. I had the PDFs, I had the lawyer, and most importantly, I had the truth. And in a world built on lies, the truth is the only thing that never devalues. The setup was Harrison's annual Founders Gala, held on the evening of September 12th at the Fairmont, San Francisco, an event designed specifically to polish the brass of his ego until it blinded everyone in the room. The grand ballroom was a sickening display of excess, featuring a $65,000 floral arrangement that cascaded from the ceiling like a frozen waterfall of white orchids and rare lilies, their scent so heavy and cloying it felt like breathing in pure silk. There were 250 elite guests present, a sea of black ties and floor-length designer gowns representing the absolute apex of Silicon Valley power and Palo Alto old money, all circulating under massive crystal chandeliers, while a live 30-piece orchestra played a muted, atmospheric arrangement of Vivaldi. Harrison was already on stage when I arrived, standing behind a custom-made mahogany lectern with the Vanderbilt Nexus Systems logo etched in silver, basking in the warm, golden glow of the spotlight like a king presiding over a loyal court. He was mid-sentence, his voice projecting a rehearsed, gravelly confidence as he spoke about integrity in leadership and the moral responsibility of the modern entrepreneur to foster transparency and character in both business and family life. I walked through the heavy, gilded double doors at exactly 9:15 p.m., my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic precision that felt like a countdown, wearing a $900 professional suit I had purchased with 4 months of saved diner tips and dry cleaning shifts. The fabric was a sharp charcoal wool that fit me like armor, a far cry from the royal blue graduation robes or the $15 discount sneakers I had worn when he last saw me, and I moved through the room with a silence that was more terrifying than any scream. I didn't yell, and I didn't make a scene that would have allowed the security guards to usher me out as a disgruntled or unstable intruder. Instead, I moved with the grace of someone who belonged in that room more than the man on the stage did. I waited patiently at the edge of the velvet-draped media pen, standing perfectly still as the local news cameras from 3 different networks pivoted their heavy lenses toward Harrison for the scheduled Family Man of the Year segment. This was the moment he had orchestrated for months, a curated piece of public relations meant to cement his image as a philanthropist and a devoted patriarch, with Candace sitting in the front row wearing a $40,000 Harry Winston necklace that sparkled with every breath she took. The red lights on the cameras flickered to life, signaling to the thousands of viewers watching the live stream and the local evening news that the pinnacle of the evening had arrived. Harrison leaned into the microphone, a humble, practiced smile spreading across his face as he began to credit his family for being the foundation of his integrity, his eyes scanning the crowd for the approval he craved like oxygen. It was then, in the precise heartbeat between his praise for himself and the applause of his peers, that I stepped out from the shadows of the floral arrangements and walked directly into the center of the frame, the $15 encrypted thumb drive on my keychain pressing firmly against my thigh. The air in the ballroom seemed to thicken as I crossed the distance toward the stage, my footsteps muffled by the thick, hand-woven Persian carpet that lined the aisles. Harrison's smile didn't just fade, it curdled, turning into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock as he realized that the girl he had officially paid off 3 months ago was now standing 5 feet away from him in the center of a nationally televised broadcast. I could see the sweat beginning to break through his $150 professional foundation, the bright stage lights catching the moisture on his forehead as he realized he couldn't stop what was about to happen without confirming every suspicion I was about to raise. The news reporter, a woman in a sharp blazer holding a microphone with the station's logo, looked between us with the predatory instinct of a journalist who had just stumbled onto the story of the decade. I didn't look at the cameras, and I didn't look at the shocked faces of the 250 guests who had stopped mid-sip of their $300 vintage Krug champagne. I looked only at Harrison, the man who had checked his $8,400 Breitling while I told him about my 4.0 GPA, and I felt nothing but the cold, satisfying weight of the truth. The silence was absolute, a jagged canyon that opened up in the middle of the Fairmont ballroom, and for a few seconds, the only sound was the distant, rhythmic thrum of the orchestra's bass section in the foyer. Harrison tried to speak, his hand reaching out in a dismissive, fatherly gesture that was intended to portray me as a confused relative, but the words died in his throat when he saw the folder I was carrying under my arm, a physical copy of the data stored on my keychain. I watched as his eyes flickered to Candace, whose face had gone a sickly, translucent white, her $150 spray tan now looking like a muddy smear against her skin as she realized that the $400,000 in consulting fees she had been collecting were no longer a secret. The news cameras zoomed in, capturing the raw, unfiltered panic of a man whose $18.4 million empire was built on a foundation of perjury and systematic neglect. I stood there, the daughter he had called a budget-draining mistake, and I waited for the reporter to ask the first question, knowing that within 20 minutes, the security system he had paid $200,000 for wouldn't be able to keep the federal investigators or the public out of his life. I remember the way the light reflected off the silver Vanderbilt logo on the lectern, a logo that was about to become synonymous with one of the largest private equity and child support fraud scandals in the history of the county. I thought about the 650-square-foot apartment where the streetlights died at 2:45 a.m., and I thought about my mother, who was likely sitting on our worn sofa right now, watching this live on her ancient television, her tired hands finally resting. Harrison's leadership speech was still ringing in the air, the words integrity and character hanging like bitter smoke over a room that was beginning to realize they were witnessing an execution. He had spent 13 years trying to ensure I remained a ghost, a line item to be minimized and a debt to be settled. But he had failed to realize that ghosts are the only ones who can walk through walls. As I handed the folder to the reporter and stepped back, allowing the flashbulbs of the photographers to erupt like 1,000 tiny suns, I realized that the $900 I had spent on my suit was the most important financial transaction of my life. I wasn't just standing on a stage. I was standing on the ruins of the Vanderbilt name, a name I had already legally discarded in a quiet courtroom 3 days prior. The contrast between the $65,000 flowers and the cold reality of the tax returns I had just made public was the ultimate expression of the justice I had been seeking since that 89-degree day in June. Harrison Vanderbilt was no longer the CEO of an $18.4 million firm or the family man of the year. He was a man being caught in a lie in front of the very people he had spent his life trying to impress. I watched as the orchestra players began to lower their instruments, the music fading into an awkward, scratching silence as the guests whispered behind their hands, the sound like the rustling of dry leaves. I had walked into the lion's den not to fight, but to turn on the lights, and the lion was currently blinking in the glare, terrified and small. This was the moment the debt was truly settled, not with a check for $216,000, but with the total and irreversible collapse of a reputation built on the exploitation of the people he was supposed to protect. I turned away from him then, not with anger, but with the same professional indifference he had shown me for 19 years, walking back toward the gilded doors as the first reporter began to shout a question about the shell companies and the $400,000 payments to his wife. I walked out of the Fairmont and into the cool, crisp San Francisco night, the fog rolling in off the bay to swallow the towers of the city. I didn't wait for the bus this time. I had already called a car, a simple black sedan that was waiting for me at the curb. As we drove away from the Gala, I looked back at the hotel, seeing the blue and red lights of a police cruiser already pulling up to the entrance, a sign that the Integrity in Leadership segment had taken a very different turn than Harrison had planned. I sat in the back of the car, the $15 thumb drive still in my hand, and I felt a profound sense of peace. I was no longer a Vanderbilt, I was no longer a mistake, and I was no longer a debt. I was Cassidy Rhodes, a sophomore at Yale with a 4.0 GPA and a future that belonged entirely to me. The moral of the story isn't that money is evil, but that the people who use it to erase others will eventually find themselves erased by the very truth they tried to hide. Family is the blood you spill for someone, not the blood you share, and Harrison had never been willing to give me anything but his silence. Now, he was going to have plenty of that in the years to come, while the rest of the world finally heard my voice. As the car crossed the bridge, the lights of the city glittering in the rearview mirror, I realized that the account was finally closed. There were no more missed recitals to count, no more Christmas trips to Aspen to mourn, and no more I forgot texts to wait for. I had taken the red Sharpie of my life, and I had crossed out every lie he had ever told about my worth. I looked down at my hands, which were steady and strong, and I thought about the first class I would attend in the morning, a seminar on the ethics of corporate governance. I smiled to myself, knowing that I already had a head start on the curriculum. The man who had spent $216,000 to pay me off had inadvertently paid for the very education I was using to dismantle him. It was a perfect, circular justice that no logistics firm could have mapped out. I leaned back into the seat, watching the road unfold ahead of me, a long and bright path that led far away from the mansions of Avon and the trailers of New Britain. I was free, and for the first time in my life, I didn't need a $200,000 security system to feel safe. I had the truth, and that was the only fortress I would ever need. I stepped onto the elevated platform, the heels of my professional shoes clicking with a sharp, rhythmic finality against the polished wood as I breached the sanctuary of Harrison's spotlight. The 250 elite guests sat frozen, their forks suspended over plates of seared sea bass and saffron risotto, as I reached into my charcoal wool blazer and withdrew a heavy, ivory-toned envelope crafted from 120-pound cotton cardstock, the kind of stationery usually reserved for the most exclusive invitations. I didn't hesitate. I stepped directly up to the mahogany lectern, leaning slightly toward the high-fidelity Shure microphone so that my voice would carry with crystal-clear resonance to the very back of the Fairmont ballroom. "A gift from your mistake, Harrison," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors that used to define our interactions, the words echoing through the expensive acoustics of the room and causing the live orchestra to stop their bows mid-stroke. Harrison's face was a study in controlled confusion, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to take the envelope, his brain clearly struggling to reconcile the polished, formidable woman standing before him with the girl he had discarded at a greasy diner 3 months prior. He opened the envelope with a flourish of practiced grace, likely expecting a sentimental tribute or perhaps a desperate plea for a second chance that he could use to further bolster his image as a benevolent patriarch in front of the local news cameras. Instead, the first thing his eyes landed on was a certified court order from the Superior Court of California, stamped with a raised gold seal that caught the glare of the overhead crystal chandeliers. I watched his pupils dilate as he read the bold, black ink that officially declared the death of his legacy. I had legally and irrevocably changed my name to Cassidy O'Connor, adopting my grandmother's maiden name and stripping away the Vanderbilt label like a layer of rotted skin. My grandmother, his own mother, was the only person who had ever seen my value, and by taking her name, I was reclaiming a history of hard work and integrity that he had long ago traded for offshore accounts and $8,400 watches. But the true weight of the gift was found on the second page, a single sheet of stark white paper that contained nothing but a large high-definition QR code printed in the center in thick, uncompromising black ink. Harrison stared at the digital square, his confusion rapidly curdling into a dark, visceral dread as the silence in the ballroom became so heavy and absolute that you could literally hear the tiny, frantic popping of the bubbles in the $200 a bottle Krug champagne sitting on the nearby tables. I leaned in closer to him, the scent of his expensive Cuban cigars now cloying and offensive, and I whispered a truth that acted like a scalpel, cutting through the layers of his $18.4 million facade. That QR code is a direct link to a cloud-based folder containing every single one of your offshore tax records, the shell company filings for Candace's consulting fees, and the evidence of the $400,000 a year you've been laundering to avoid support payments, I murmured, my breath hitching only with the satisfaction of the kill. I watched the blood drain from his face, the expensive foundation he wore failing to hide the gray, ashen hue of a man who realized his fortress had been breached from the inside. And because I know how much you value efficiency, Harrison, I've already sent the unencrypted master files to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the California Franchise Tax Board exactly 15 minutes ago, I added, the corners of my mouth twitching into the first real smile I had shared with him in a decade. The local news reporter was still standing just 3 feet away, her microphone angled toward us, capturing the sound of his ragged, uneven breathing as the family man of the year began to hyperventilate under the weight of his own crimes. The guests began to murmur, a low, buzzing sound like a hornet's nest being disturbed, as they realized the woman on stage wasn't giving a toast, but a eulogy for Harrison's reputation. Candace had stood up from her seat in the front row, her $40,000 Harry Winston necklace catching the light as she clutched at her throat, her eyes darting toward the exit as she calculated how quickly her $115,000 G-Wagon could get her away from the impending collapse. I didn't move. I stood my ground on that stage, looking out over the sea of San Francisco's elite, the people who had spent their evening nodding along to Harrison's lies about integrity and leadership. I felt the weight of the $15 encrypted thumb drive on my keychain, a small plastic object that had proven more powerful than his $200,000 security system or his $600 an hour legal teams. The $216,000 he had paid in child support over 13 years was now a drop in the ocean compared to the back taxes, penalties, and legal fees that were about to rain down on his head. A financial storm that would strip him of the very mansion and the very status he had used to belittle my mother and me. The silence that followed my whisper was the most profound moment of my 19 years, a vacuum of sound where the reality of my new identity as Cassidy O'Connor finally took root. I looked at Harrison one last time, seeing not a powerful CEO or a formidable father, but a small, terrified man who had built a life out of paper and glass. He reached for the lectern to steady himself, his knuckles turning white against the dark mahogany, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air in an environment it no longer understood. The ivory envelope fell from his hands, the certified court order fluttering down to the Persian carpet where it landed face up, a public record of his failure to own the one thing that actually mattered. I stepped back from the microphone, the feedback creating a sharp, piercing whine that acted as a period at the end of my sentence, and I began to walk toward the stairs. Every step I took away from him felt like shedding a lead weight, the air in the ballroom finally feeling cool and clean as I moved past the $65,000 floral arrangements that were already beginning to wilt under the heat of the stage lights. I passed the news crew, the reporter's eyes wide with the realization that she had just witnessed the lead story for the next 6 months, and I didn't stop until I reached the heavy, gilded double doors of the Fairmont. I didn't look back to see him fall, and I didn't wait to hear the questions that were currently being shouted by the people who had been his friends 5 minutes ago. I was no longer interested in his narrative or his budget or his calculations of ROI. I was Cassidy O'Connor, a woman who had used the very intelligence he tried to suppress to dismantle the cage he had built for me. The moral of the story isn't just that the truth sets you free, it's that the truth is a debt that eventually collects itself, and I was simply the one who walked into the ballroom to serve the final notice. As I pushed through the doors and into the quiet, fog-drenched night of San Francisco, the sound of the city's traffic felt like a symphony compared to the hollow jazz of the Gala. I touched the ivory-colored business card in my pocket, the one Skylar Sterling had given me, knowing that the next few months would be a whirlwind of depositions and testimonies, but for the first time, I wouldn't be doing it for a pittance of child support. I would be doing it for the woman who lived in a 650-square-foot apartment and the girl who wore $15 sneakers, ensuring that the man who lived in the mansion finally understood the cost of a mistake. The bubbles in the champagne might have been popping in the ballroom, but out here, under the vast, indifferent sky, I was finally breathing air that didn't taste like someone else's lies. I walked toward the waiting car, my heart light and my name finally, beautifully, my own. Harrison had spent his life protecting his revenue, but he had forgotten that the most valuable asset any person can possess is their own story. And I had just taken the pen back for good. The drive back toward my dorm at Yale wasn't just a commute. It was a victory lap through a world that no longer had the power to define me as a budget-draining liability. I thought about the 4.0 GPA I would continue to maintain, not to prove anything to a man in a Breitling watch, but because the economics of my own life were finally trending upward. I was the daughter of a woman who chose me every day, and now I was the woman who had chosen herself over a mountain of hollow gold. As the car sped across the Bay Bridge, the lights of the city reflecting off the dark water like a million discarded diamonds, I realized that I had reached the end of the ledger. The debts were paid, The name was changed, and the truth was out in the world, spreading like a wildfire through the logistics of a man who thought he could control the wind. I was Cassidy O'Connor, and for the first time in 19 years, I wasn't waiting for a text message or a check or a sign of pride. I had given myself the only gift that mattered, the absolute, unwavering knowledge that I was worth more than he could ever afford to pay. The ballroom was behind me, the sirens were ahead of him, and the road in front of me was wide, dark, and perfectly, wonderfully open. I leaned my head against the window, watching the stars struggle through the fog, and I knew that tomorrow morning, when the sun rose over the campus, I would wake up as a person who finally, truly existed. The fallout from that night at the Fairmont was absolute and uncompromising, a systemic collapse that no amount of crisis management or expensive public relations could slow down. Within 48 hours of the gala, the story had transitioned from a local society scandal to a national financial headline, with the Vanderbilt Nexus Systems stock price plummeting a staggering 22% as investors fled the stench of a federal investigation. The board of directors, men who had previously toasted Harrison as a visionary leader, moved with a ruthless speed to distance themselves from the wreckage, placing him on indefinite administrative leave while the company's internal auditors began the grueling process of tracing every dollar he had funneled through Candace's shell companies. Harrison is currently submerged in the depths of a high-stakes federal audit led by the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, a process that legal experts estimate could cost him over $2.1 million in back taxes, civil penalties, and interest, not to mention the looming possibility of felony charges for perjury and systematic tax evasion. The 7-bedroom smart home in Avon, once a fortress of his absolute control, is now a hive of activity for investigators in dark suits who are meticulously cataloging the very assets he used to make me feel small. While Harrison's world is being dismantled brick by brick, I have finally found the quiet, steady rhythm of the life I built for myself. I moved into my dorm room at Yale University, a small but sunlit space that carries the scent of old books and fresh parchment rather than the cloying weight of Cuban cigars and artificial perfumes. My mailbox in the residential college hall now bears a simple, elegant label that reads C. O'Connor, a name that represents a heritage of resilience and the woman who stayed when the world was dark. Every time I see those letters, I feel a surge of a very specific kind of peace, the kind that only comes when you realize that the poison has finally been purged from your system. I don't have his $18.4 million in annual revenue, and I don't have a $115,000 Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon parked in the lot. But I have something that Harrison Vanderbilt will never understand because he tried to trade it for a higher profit margin. I have my soul intact and unburdened by the weight of his expectations or his neglect. The technical reality of my life is now defined by hard work and genuine achievement rather than the transactional cruelty of a budget-draining childhood. I spend my mornings in advanced microeconomics seminars, my 4.0 GPA a testament to a mind that refused to be dimmed by the shadows of a 650-square-foot apartment where the lights went out at 2:45 a.m. I still work, taking a position at the university library to cover my daily expenses, but the labor no longer feels like a desperate scramble for survival. It feels like the steady construction of a future that belongs entirely to me. I watch the news occasionally, seeing clips of Harrison leaving his lawyer's office with a coat draped over his head to hide from the very cameras he once courted, and I feel a profound sense of closure that has nothing to do with revenge. I didn't need to destroy him to find my peace. I only needed to stop allowing him to define my value through a series of bank transfers and, I forgot, texts. He thought he was paying me off with $216,000, but he was actually just funding the education of the woman who would eventually hold him accountable. My mother is finally breathing easier too, her back no longer carrying the literal and figurative weight of Harrison's financial warfare. I was able to use the back pay settlement we secured through Skylar Sterling's office to ensure she never has to work a double shift at the hospital again, and she has moved into a small, light-filled cottage where the streetlights stay on as long as she wants them to. We sit on her porch sometimes, drinking coffee that doesn't have to be rationed, and we talk about the O'Connor legacy, a history of people who worked with their hands and kept their word. The Vanderbilt name has become a cautionary tale in the business world, a case study in how the lack of personal integrity can act as a terminal flaw in even the most profitable logistics empire. Harrison's $200,000 security system proved useless against a daughter who simply walked through the front door with the truth, and his $8,400 Breitling couldn't buy him 1 second of the time he wasted being a stranger to his own child. I think back to that 89-degree day in June, the heat radiating off the stadium track and the silence of the man who refused to clap for his valedictorian daughter. I realize now that his silence wasn't a reflection of my worth, but a confession of his own emptiness. He was a man so terrified of being seen as a mistake that he tried to erase the only person who was living proof of his humanity. By legally erasing him from my name and my future, I didn't just find peace. I found my own voice, a voice that is no longer whispering for a father's approval, but speaking clearly about a future built on honor and grit. The moral of this journey is that family isn't a debt to be settled or a budget to be balanced. Family is the people who show up, the people who stay, and the people who would never dream of putting a price tag on your existence. Harrison Vanderbilt is a man defined by his losses now, while I, Cassidy O'Connor, am a woman defined by everything I had the courage to keep. The sun sets over the Yale campus, casting long purple shadows across the stone arches and the vibrant green of the courtyards, and I feel a sense of belonging that is deeper than any zip code or mansion could provide. I am 19 years old, and I have already survived the worst thing a parent can do to a child, which is to treat them as an expense rather than a miracle. I have the encrypted thumb drive tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of the battle I won, but I no longer feel the need to carry it as a weapon. The truth is out, the account is settled, and the ledger is finally, beautifully balanced. I walk toward the dining hall, my charcoal suit replaced by a simple sweater, my steps light and my head held high, knowing that I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I am a student. I am a daughter of a woman who loved me through the dark, and I am a woman who knows that the most expensive thing in the world is a lie you have to keep telling yourself. I chose the truth. I chose the O'Connor name, and in doing so, I chose a life that is worth more than all the revenue in Palo Alto combined. The silence of my dorm room at night is a different kind of quiet than the silence of the trailer park. It is a silence of possibility, of a mind finally free to dream without the intrusion of a father's disappointment. I look at my Yale ID card, seeing the name Cassidy O'Connor printed in clean, modern type, and I realize that the mistake Harrison made was never me. His mistake was thinking that wealth could act as a substitute for character, and that power could buy silence from the very person he taught to be loud. The federal audit will eventually conclude, the penalties will be paid, and the stock price might even one day recover. But the relationship he severed on that June afternoon can never be reconstructed. He is a ghost in a mansion, and I am a living, breathing testament to the fact that you cannot bury the truth in a shallow grave of gold. I am finally, undeniably and perfectly at peace with the person I have become in the absence of the man who didn't want me. As I close my textbooks for the night and turn off the lamp, the darkness of the room is warm and welcoming, a space where I am safe and known. I think about the thousands of other people who might be sitting in their own versions of a 2012 Toyota Corolla right now, clutching a red Sharpie and a piece of cardboard, wondering if they have the strength to walk away from a name that poisons them. I want them to know that the air is clearer on the other side, and that your value was never theirs to decide in the first place. You can erase the name on the birth certificate and the mailbox, and you can build a throne out of the very bricks they threw at you. I did it with a $15 thumb drive and a 4.0 GPA, and I did it because I realized that being a Vanderbilt was a debt I no longer had to pay. I am Cassidy O'Connor, and my story is just beginning, written in an ink that can never be washed away by a father's indifference or a millionaire's greed. The account is closed, the audit is over, and I am finally, truly truly home.